Before we talk about how to polychain, we should probably just cover the simple question, which is, what is polychaining? Polychaining is taking two or more synthesizers, linking them together in some way that allows us to increase the amount of polyphony that's available to us. Those synths could be polyphonic synths already, or they could be monophonic synths. Doesn't matter. In fact, you can polychain pretty much any synthesizer as long as there's a way to link it with others. And that linkage has got to be either MIDI capability or CV and gate ins and outs. If you've got those on a synth, then you can link it with other synths and increase the polyphony that's available to you. However, having said that, there are manufacturers of synthesizers that build polychaining capability into their synthesizers to make it simpler for us to polychain them together. And Behringer is one such manufacturer that does this. It's done it with the DeepMind, which you can polychain, and it's also done it with the Model D that I've got here. Now, as you'll see, I've got a Eurorack case here with the Model Ds in, and there's a whole load of cables here to connect them together. You don't need to do that to polychain these synths together. It's just the way I've ended up deciding to polychain them, and I will explain what I've done, how I've done it, and why a bit later on in this video. But what we'll start off with is the Behringer supplied way of polychaining, which is to use MIDI cables, and I'll show you that first. I've got a keyboard, it's just down here out of sight, you can't quite see it unfortunately, but this is a MIDI cable that comes out of it, and I'm going to plug that into the MIDI in of the first Model D that I've got down the bottom here. Then I'm going to need 3 more MIDI cables, because we're basically just going to daisy chain them all together. There's a MIDI through, so we take that as our output from our Model D, and we plug it into the input of the next one. So now they're all connected together, they're all listening on the same MIDI channel, so if I play a note, they're all going to play that note. And that actually on its own is a useful thing. It's kind of unison mode, right? For really, really big fat leads and basses and stuff like that. I've got 3 oscillators in each of these synths. I've got 12 in total, which I could be playing all at the same time. I'll do that in a second so you can hear it. But first of all, we've got to hear it. So each of these synths has got a mono output, and I've got to mix those together. There's no way around it. You need a mixer at this point. Now I've got a big mixer, but I also, for convenience, because I put these units into my Eurorack case, I've got a little mini mixer. There's nothing magical about this little module here. It's just a mixer. It takes 4 inputs. It allows me to set the level of each one, and it also allows me to pan them in the stereo field, which is quite handy to have those controls really, close to you. So what I'm going to do now is connect each of these synths up to my mixer, and then I've got a stereo output going into my main mixer, which is where you can hear this. So with them all just connected with the MIDI, I'll play a note. That is 12 oscillators, and I did tune them all just before I started recording. They're gonna go out of tune, trust me, but we'll hear that when it happens. Okay, so before we get on to polychaining itself, while we've got the synthesizer set up in this sort of monophonic unison mode, I want to take a little time out to talk about controls. And the adjustments that we have to make when we're creating a patch. Now, the Behringer Model D has got a lot of controls, and that's a good thing. There's no mini diving with this synthesizer. A lot of dials, a lot of switches. Now, when it comes to creating a patch and then replicating that patch over multiple units, there's a lot of knob twiddling that goes on. And although the knobs have got little marks on them to show you, you know, how far round you are with a particular adjustment. You can't take that for granted that it's going to be the same effect with the same sound on another Model D. Just the way that they're designed internally, the analog nature of them means that it's only a rough guide as to what you see around any particular knob. So there's quite a lot of knob twiddling that you have to do. It sounds like fun, it is fun at the beginning, but it can get quite tedious, it can be quite laborious. You certainly don't want to be doing it when you're under any kind of time pressure to produce some music. Now there are some things that you can do to help automate certain aspects of setting up a patch. And by that I'm talking about these semi-modular CV and gate ins and outs that Behringer have provided across the top of the synthesizer. Using those CVs and gates ins and outs, you can automate a certain amount of the adjustments that you'd make on one synth and replicate them across other synthesizers. So that's what I want to show you next. I'm just going to use two Model Ds for this particular demonstration. And then once we've covered that and we've seen the sort of pros and cons of doing it, we'll move on to polychaining itself. Okay, so we're in this unison monophonic mode right now, so both synths are going to play the same note when I press a key. And what I've done is I panned one fully to the left and the other fully to the right, so hopefully that'll help to differentiate the sound when you hear it. Right, so they're both on full sustain at the moment. Let's say that we want to have quite a short decay. I'm going to isolate just the bottom one and make the changes I need to down here. So turn the sustain all the way down and then give it a little bit of decay. Okay, and then I would want to replicate it on the second synth. Not a problem. Takes 2 seconds. Third synth, fourth synth, however many you've got. Let's say that we want to automate it. So we just want to make the changes to one synth and it will apply to the others. What we can do is use the CV and gates. Well, sorry, we're just going to talk about CVs for the time being. Okay, so there is an output called loudness contour out. So whatever I've got here in terms of a loudness contour, as it's being triggered, the attack, the decay, sustain, and any release that I've got set up going on around here will be output as a control voltage out of here. There's also an input for loudness contour. It's called loud CV in. And what I can do is take a patch cable, take the loudness contour out from this synth into this synth, and now both synths are going to have or share the same loudness contour. So let's just hear that. That's just this one, and here's the second one. Okay, so if I change this one, hopefully you can hear that's affecting them both at the same time, and that is fantastic. I could do it with just 2 synths, I could do it with 20. The same approach. However, the way that you can daisy chain MIDI, you can't daisy chain these patch cables. I can't go out, in, out, in, out, in, etc. This input here is not then transmitted out here. This out is purely what you've got set in your synthesizer and nothing else. So what I'd need to do to control n number of synths is to take one out here, split it into how many different cables I need, and then apply that to the other synthesizers. That's not a big deal, it works. It's quite standard practice with modular synthesis to be able to do that, so it's not something that will be a problem. But there is one bug that I found doing this, and there's also a caveat as to when you can do it, basically. Now the bug is to do with, let's just get rid of this cable a sec. The bug is to do with the contour itself, the loudness contour itself. Both the loudness contour and the filter contour, they're not full ADSR envelopes. There's no release control. If you want there to be a release, then you need to flick a switch, and then when you flick that switch, whatever your decay setting is will also be your release setting, which is absolutely fine, not really a limitation. Now let me just listen to this bottom synth on its own. So let's turn off the attack. Okay, make it moderately long but not too long. So that's while I'm holding down a note. As soon as I just take my finger off and hit the key very quickly, there's no release. But when I press this, now my decay is also a release. Now the bug is that the effect of this switch is not being transmitted out of this socket. So there is no way to, using this method, control and give a release part of an envelope to any other synthesizer. It doesn't work, and this is clearly a bug in my opinion. It's hopefully something that Behringer can easily fix in firmware, but it has no effect at all. There's nothing I can do, so let's just demonstrate that. If I switch them both on, so if I press the key really quickly, you'll hear in one channel you've got the release going on, which is this synth, and in the other channel this thing is still no release at all, just getting cut dead as soon as I take my finger off the key. This won't have any effect. Nothing in terms of dials and controls will have an effect. It's receiving a CV in here, and that CV is being cut off as soon as I let go of the key. It's a bug. Now, what's the caveat of using a cable like this to sort of replicate your envelope? Well, like I said at the beginning, the envelope is transmitted out of here when it's triggered. So when I trigger a note, these voltages are being sent out in real time to the other synthesizers. So I can use them while the other synthesizers are all playing their notes at the same time, which both of these are. They're both hooked up to play the same note at the same time. But let's say that I was in polychain mode, polyphonic mode, and I was playing an arpeggio, and I wanted this one to have a long decay, and then this one would play a little bit later its own note with a long decay, and they kind of overlap each other and it sounds gorgeous. I can't use this method because this method is sending out the control voltage for this envelope when it's triggered, and I'd need it to be sent out at a different time to affect this. So it won't work unless you're playing notes at the same time, triggering them at the same time. Now let's talk about the filter. We can automate and replicate the filter contour exactly the same way that we have just done so with the loudness contour. The filter contour also has a release switch, and you'll be pleased to know that that actually works fine. There's no problem replicating it across other synthesizers. It works fine. So let's take another patch cable. There is filter contour out, and there is cut CV in, cut off CV in. Okay, so what I'm going to need to do to demonstrate this is to take the cutoffs down on both of them. Otherwise we're not going to hear anything. I'm going to increase the resonance as well, because that always helps to accentuate the sound of a filter. And now I'm going to turn down the sustain just on this one and give it a little bit of a short decay. Long decay. attack. Let me just isolate them so I just can tell that they're both making the same kind of sound. That's the bottom one. And yeah, that's the top one. Let me just turn the release off. Okay, so they're both working fine. Now, there's a caveat with the filter envelope as well. So before we start doing all this business, if we're setting up a filter contour to affect our filter on our own synth, the amount of filter contour, how much of an effect it has, is controlled by this amount of contour dial. If we just listen to this bottom one, this is on maximum, halfway, and then just a quarter of the way around. Okay. When we take the filter contour CV and pass it into another synth, how much of it is taking an effect is kind of hardwired inside the synth. This filter contour amount is right down to 0 at the moment, but it's sounding the same as if it had been set to 50%. This is the bottom one, this is the top one. If we were to apply 50% here, the same as below, it would actually have an effect. It would add to whatever is this hardwired amount. And it's now really quite long. So what that actually means is that the minimum amount that when you're using CV in, the minimum amount that the filter contour will affect the filter via the CV in is about 50%. It can't be any less than that. It can be a lot more than that, but no less than that. For me personally, that's a big shame, because a lot of the patches that I make on the Model D, I'm using really quite small, subtle amounts of filter contour amount. I'm around 2, 3, 4, 5 maximum, but I'm generally in this kind of range. It's really nice. You get some really lovely little subtle effects with the filter around this range, and you will not be able to have that kind of effect when you're using the CV method. So for that reason alone, I don't bother. Even though there's no bug with the switch, I don't bother with using CV in and out to control and replicate the filter contour. And because of the bug here, and because I like to have release on a lot, I don't bother with it either here. Okay, so just one more tiny thing that I want to just cover before we get onto polychaining, because you'll see that it has an implication on polychain mode for these synthesizers. And that is note priority and retriggering. So I'm just going to listen to one of these synths. It's not in polychain mode. There's no polychaining going on here at all. Okay, this is just the bottom synth that we're hearing here. Now, when I hold down a note and I press another one while that note is still held down, then the synth will have a certain behavior which you can change. My synth here is set up with last note priority, which means it will always play the last note that is held down, whether it's higher or lower. Now you can have 3 settings: last note priority like this, or you can have high note priority, which means always the higher note plays, so this would sound, but down here it wouldn't sound at all. And you can have low note priority. And you can set the synthesizers. If you look in the user manual, you can see that you can set them by flicking a switch on startup of the synth. There's one other setting that you can also set by flicking the switch, and that is re-trigger mode. So as you'll hear, there's an initial envelope being triggered, but then subsequent keys are not re-triggering the envelope. If I turn the sustain down, it'll be even more obvious. going to go really quiet. Here, the filter. The envelope is not being re-triggered. You can enable it if you want to by flicking switches when you switch the unit on. But I'm leaving it off for the time being. Now, why am I mentioning these two settings? Is because they still have an effect when we go into polychain mode, it's going to be easier if I just describe it and show it to you now before we go into polychain mode. But we'll do that. And polychaining is also enabled by flicking switches on the front panel of the synth straight after you switched it on. Within the 5 seconds of switching it on, you flick this switch here, which is the tuning switch. You flick it on and off, and that will enable polychain. Now, you only need to do it on one synth, and you do it on the synth that's at the beginning of the MIDI chain. So the MIDI cable coming out of my keyboard is going into this bottom one, and then from here to here, here to here. So I'm only going to flick the switches on this bottom one to enable polychain across all these synths. So let's give that a go now. Power it off. On, off, on, off. You'll see that the mains light blinked very rapidly, and actually all of the synthesizers that are chained together, the mains of the power light blink rapidly for them all. So polychaining is now enabled on all of the synths. If I want to disable it, I just do the same thing again. Let's turn it off. On, off, and you'll see they're now blinking slowly, which means it's been turned off. Polychaining is off. Now, when you enable polychaining, what's happening is each synth is, the first synth in the chain is determining that polychain is on. It will now respond to the first note that is ever pressed. And it'll pass the other notes on to the other synths. The second synth gets some sort of message from the first one. Polychaining is now enabled. It will now take the second note, and the third unit will take the third note, etc., etc., etc. So they all now have allocated to themselves which note they're going to play. And it's important before you want to use them individually and start, if I was to route the keyboards just straight into the second one because I just want to play it on its own, it's still in polychain mode. It's still only going to be responding to the second note. It's important that while they're all chained together, that you turn in polychaining off before you use the synths for any other purpose. But now, I turned it off, didn't I? Let me turn it back on. On, off. Fast blinking of the lights, it's enabled. So, first note I hold down will be played by this. Let's turn the sustain back up. Second note I hold down will be played by the second synth, which I have switched off. First note, first synth. Second note, second synth. Third note, third synth. So now I can hear we've got some serious tuning issues, so I'm just going to resolve those. So one implication of the way that the polychaining has been implemented by Behringer is that this first synth will always play single notes. You'll hear it most of the time. When you start to play chords or hold down more than one note at the same time, that's when the other units will kick in. So for that reason, what I've done in terms of panning them is I've got the first synth panned in the middle of the stereo field, so it's coming equally out of the left and right channels. Then the second synth is coming out only from the left, and the top synth is only coming out from the right, just to give it a little bit of sort of stereo interest. Now, the reason why I mentioned triggering of notes, trigger priority, re-triggering and note priority at the beginning, is because there is still this monophonic behavior going on with these synthesizers, even though there's polychaining. Even though this one will take the first note, this one will take the second, and this one will take the third, they're still going to respond to more than one key being held down in a kind of monophonic way, which I find very, very weird. If you know about it and you're noodling away, it can create some interesting effects, but it can be highly annoying. I'll try and describe and show why that is. Let's say I'm holding down a chord and I let go. One note rings out. Now you'll see that I'm actually intentionally sort of rolling my hand off to the right so that I'm letting go of this one first, then this one, then this one. If I roll my hand off the other way, so let go of the top one first, there is no ringing out of a note. But this way, there is. Now when you're playing chords, you know, you're into the music, you're playing, it's very, very difficult to be mindful of exactly how you take your hand off the keyboard when you're playing chords. And what you'll find is that as you're playing, you'll get these ringing out notes that you aren't expecting. And it's because of this monophonic behavior that's going on with these synths, which is not totally cancelled out when you tell the synths to go into polychain mode. And it can be very annoying. The other reason for polychaining synths together is so that you do have long releases, and you're playing an arpeggio or a sequence, and you want those individual notes to sort of like overlap each other in a way that a monophonic synth wouldn't be able to do. The trouble is that the way polychaining works is that first note is always going to be played by the first synth in the chain. The other synths never get a look in. So you never get this sort of ringing out of one note still going on when you press the second note, because it gets cancelled out, because it's always the first synth that's playing it. I might well not be in polychain mode if I'm playing a sequence. What I'd really like is there to be some sort of round robin algorithm going on, which means that they'll take turns to play the notes that I'm holding down, and if they took turns to play the notes I'm holding down, I would get true polyphonic, sort of one release overlapping the next note, overlapping the next note. But as it is, the way it's been implemented, that never happens. This first synth always plays the first note. And it's for these two reasons, the weird ringing out of notes when you release chords, and the fact that it's not a true polyphonic behavior when you're playing one note at a time. For these reasons, I decided to sort of ditch the Behringer way of polychaining using MIDI and actually use the modular CV and gate method instead, and that's what I'll show you next. Right, the method of polychaining which I've ended up adopting for these synths does require an external piece of equipment, and I've got this unit here. It's a MIDI to CV and gate converter. This one is by a company called Mutable Instruments. It's called Yarns. I featured it in another video that I've done. I really like it. What it does is it supports up to 4 voice polyphony. So with these 4 units that I've got here, I'll show you how I set it up. There are many other MIDI to CV converters out there. This one is a Eurorack module. You can get standalone ones as well, so you don't need to think about putting your synths in a rack in order to do what I'm doing here. But you do need something that will accept a MIDI signal and then split that MIDI signal out into multiple CV and gate combinations. So to connect these CV and gates up to the Model D, there is a oscillator voltage 1 volt per octave CV in here. So all I need to do is take a patch cable and go from, I'm going to do this for the number 3, this is going to be my third synth, I'm going to plug that straight into there. And then in terms of the gate, that's telling the envelopes when to trigger, and there are 2 envelopes and there are 2 gate inputs. There's a filter cutoff gate input and a loudness contour gate input. And so I need to take this gate output and plug it into both of these 2. And the way that I'm going to do that is with a patch cable that looks like this, as well as having the 2 plugs on either end. They've also got inbuilt sockets, and what that allows me to do is to sort of daisy chain them together like that. So now all 3 of these plugs are connected together, so I can go from the gate output into one gate input and into the other gate input to make sure that the filter contour, the loudness contour are both triggered when I hold down a note. So that's the first one set up. I'll now do it quickly for the other ones. Right, the last thing that I need to connect is actually the MIDI cable from the keyboard. So let me just do that next. Right, there we go. Now we have got all this spaghetti, everything's wired up. Let's see what it sounds like. So, 2 advantages with this approach. In fact, there's 3. 2 initial advantages. Considering the way that the Behringer implementation worked, every time I hold down a note, it's got a round robin kind of algorithm going on in here, and I don't know if you can see that with these lights. Each time a note is pressed, a different note is pressed, it will hand that note out to a different synthesizer. So all of the synthesizers get an opportunity to play a note, which means if you've got long releases, you get true polyphonic sound. You get that overlapping release of one note as another synth plays the next note, etc., etc., etc. Second benefit is that there is no sort of monophonic synthesizer behavior going on. There's no ringing out of notes when I take my hand off of playing a chord. I don't get any unexpected behaviour at all. And that's perfect as far as I'm concerned. The third benefit is that investing in a piece of equipment like this means that I can use it to polychain pretty much any synthesizer that I own. Any synthesizer that can handle CV and gate inputs can be added to this, or I could swap a Model D out and put a different synth in. It's really, really flexible. I can use it for pretty much anything, not just these Model Ds. There, so I guess that brings us right back to where we started with this video. What I would like to sort of say in terms of a quick summary is that the Behringer Model D approach to polychaining using MIDI cables, although it will get you started, it'll get sounds out of multiple units for you. It is a flawed implementation, and I would strongly recommend, if you're serious about this, that you look to getting a MIDI to CV converter, one that supports polyphony and one that allows you to get a really true sort of polyphonic response out of your synthesizers. It's going to make a huge difference to the sounds that you can create. So that's it. That's the end of the video. It's been a very, very long one. I'm really sorry for that, and I appreciate your patience getting to the end with me. Until the next time, thanks very much for watching.